Bava Batra Kuf Nun Hey and Kuf Nun Vav Amud Aleph. Innocence, Xanoch Lena'ar al pi Darko. Firstly, the shir is sponsored by Daniel Kellerman. Daniel and his family were members of my father's kehillah back in California before he passed away. Daniel is now a regular Talmud of the Matmonim, so one of our friends and colleagues. He's dedicating the shir to the memory of his mother, Mrs. Jean Kellerman, that's Chernachina Bas Chaim, whose strong Jewish identity and her propensity for personal growth inspired her children to embrace Torah Judaism. It's amazing the role of the mothers of so many people in ensuring that the children grow up al pi Torah. And the shir is about raising children al pi Torah. The Gemara says in Brochus, Al yipater adam michavero ela mitoch devar halacha. One should only leave one's friend if one's departing from somebody for a period. One should do that with a word of halacha, shemitoch kach zochrehu, because in that way he remembers him. And I'll be having to go away on a trip for a couple of weeks, so it's beautiful that we can part from a devar halacha. It's interesting that Rav Kook in Ayin Ayah seems to translate zochrehu, not that by doing so you'll remember the person. It's by doing so you'll remember the halacha. You'll remember the learning. Because he says when you part from somebody, it's the end of a parsha. It's the end of a paragraph. It's the end of a chapter. You'll start a new chapter when you get back. And everybody in public speaking knows you've got to be very deliberate about how you choose to close your speech. Because that's the sentence people will remember. And so the end of a parasha, when a relationship comes to a temporary end for a period of time, what you talk about at the end, at the last line of that parasha, is what people go away with and what they remember. So that you and I can carry this shir with us over the next few weeks and remain connected and attached in that way. And we'll be learning an incredibly important principle in chinuch, in raising children. So if you're a parent, be very conscious, learn the shir carefully. If you're a grandparent or a great-grandparent, learn it with your children or your grandchildren. Because there's a principle in the shir that the Rambam will teach us that tends to be lost in Torah education in many circles today. The sugya we're busy with from yesterday until today, Daf Kuf Nun Hey and Daf Kuf Nun Vav, is Me'ei matai mocher b'nichsei aviv. From when can a person begin to trade in the properties that he inherited from his father as a child? And there's a machlokas whether it's 18 years or 20 years, and we go with 20 years. Why? It says the Gemara at the top of Kuf Nun Vav, Kim lehu l'Rabbanan diyenukum b'karve da'atei gabi zuzi. The Rabbanan have established through their understanding of human nature that a child is attracted to cash. And if you allow a child, meaning between the age of 13 to 20, to deal in the properties, somebody will hold some money in front of him, and he'll sell all his father's investments so as to get some immediate cash. And we discussed yesterday what that means and the meaning of that of this chazal. But we also talked about the fact, really, that you need a level of mental maturity and sophistication of a 20-year-old to be permitted to trade, but you're chayav b'mitzvot from 13. The child of 13 has to understand what the mitzvot are and is obligated with the mitzvot and can be punishable and can be punished in terms of a beis din for breaking the mitzvot. At 13, when you need at least the age of 18 or 20 to trade, why for Torah? Why for Torah and mitzvot is at such a young age? It's quite interesting. Where do we even know from that a child is chayav mitzvahs from the age 13? So we've got it in Pirkei Avot, in the famous statement of Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, where we understand part of it. It's ben chamesh shanim lemikra. A 5-year-old can start learning Chumash. Chumash is narrative. Chumash is stories at that level. There's something for a 5-year-old to enjoy and to connect to in the stories of Chumash. Start teaching a child Chumash. Ben Eser Mishnah. At 10 years old, start teaching him Mishnayos. And you teach him Mishnayos not like you're learning Mishnayos every morning. You're learning with the Gemaras, Be'ir, and you just teach him the Mishnayos because a 10-year-old, the child absorbs information. And he wants to know the facts, the information, the cases. The child likes to remember the Mishnayos. It's a great age. 10 to 15 is the age to learn Mishnayos. And then 15, you start teaching him Gemara. That's when his mind starts developing analytically and conceptually, and he can start learning Gemara. In between, Ben Shlosh Yisrael mitzvot. But 2 years before he even starts learning Gemara, he's already chayav b'mitzvahs. So he's learned the Mishnayos, and he's learned the halachot, because that's like Mishnah, it's just stating the facts. He's gone through the halachot in the Shulchan Aruch, he's been taught. So he knows what to do, but he can't possibly have an understanding or an appreciation of those mitzvot, and yet he's obligated already. The Rosh says in Tshuvas that Klal Tet Zayin, that it's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. That's Hashem set like all the measurements of the Torah are set. What's a kazayis, what's a revius, all these ages, these are all measurements that are set for every mitzvah, which is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. It was given by God to Moshe on Sinai. But Rashi in Nozir, we know of course that Rashi in Nozir is not Rashi, but he's an important Rishon, whoever he is, we don't know who he is, learns it out of the case of Shimon and Levi, who are called Ish Charbo. Each man took his sword. And Rashi says you can figure it out that they were 13 when they did that. And so you see the Torah from the age of 13. That's the first time we see the Torah using the word Ish to describe a person, and therefore a person is an adult from the age of 13. That's where Rashi on Nozir learns it from. Wherever we learn it from, it's clear that from a very young age, a person is expected to keep the mitzvot. So have a look at this Rambam. The Rambam says in Hilchos Machlos Asuros Perek Yud Zayin, Katan she'achal echad mima'achalot asurot, if a young child under 13 ate something which is not kosher, or she'asam lacha b'Shabbat, en beit din mitzuvin alav lafrisho. You don't have, the Beis Din doesn't have to get involved. The Rav of the shul doesn't have to get involved and say to the child, you shouldn't be eating this tray food. The fisher eino ben dat. He doesn't have the intelligence to understand what he's doing. He's under the age of 13. That's if he does it himself, but you can't give him something treif to eat. That you can't do because of chinuch and so on. But in the very next halacha, the Rambam says, Afal pi she'ein beit din mitzuvim lahafrish et hakatan. Even though the Beis Din isn't commanded to separate the katan, to take the food away from him, mitzvah al aviv lig'or bo v'lahafrisho. His father should scold him and should separate him from the issur. That is a chiyuv for the father. Why? Kedei lechancho b'kedusha. Look at these words. So as to educate the child in sanctity. Sanctity needs education. You can't just get it. People go to the kotel and they say, they felt the kedusha. Nonsense. You can't feel the kedusha if you haven't been educated to feel kedusha. You feel emotion. You feel excitement. You feel all sorts of it. Your imagination is active, and that's a wonderful thing, but it's not Kedusha. Kedusha is hard work. To be able to sense Kedusha, to be able to plug into Kedusha and to be sure that it's really Kedusha, that needs upbringing, that needs raising, that needs education. Lechancho b'Kedusha. The Rambam doesn't say lechancho b'mitzvot. It's not to train him in the doing of a mitzvah. It's to train him in sanctity, to train him in Kedusha. Now, this child that you're training is how old? He's under 13, right? How much da'at does he have? The Rambam says, Lefi she'eino ben da'at. We're still talking about the same child we spoke about in the previous halakha. He doesn't have da'at. He doesn't have intelligence. He doesn't have conceptual understanding. He might have a high IQ, but he doesn't have the sophistication and intellectual maturity to understand mitzvot, which is why the Rov doesn't have to get involved to educate him at that time. But the father does. Kedei lechancho b'kedusha shene'emar Chanoch lנער al pi דרכו. Because of the posuk that you've got to train every child according to his way, which we always take to mean you've got to train the child according to his particular. There's some children who need certain type of education, another child needs different education. The fi darko, understand the needs of the individual child and train the child accordingly, educate the child accordingly. But it seems the Rambam wants to learn Chanoch lנער al pi דרכו a different way. Not that the first way is wrong, it's absolutely right, of course. But there's another dimension to Chanoch lנער al pi דרכו. The Rambam seems to be saying, educate a young child according to the way a young child should be educated. And that's different from a child who is intellectually sophisticated. That's different from a child who does have the mental capacity. And what's the way to be mechanech a child? What's the darko? That's mitzvah alaviv ligor bo lafrisho. You've got to stop him from doing averot. You've got to create an environment for him in which he's keeping the mitzvot even though he doesn't understand it. So we need to understand the difference between the mental capacity needed to trade and for other elements. What else happens at 20 years old? That's when Hashem holds you responsible b'dinei shamayim. That a 13-year-old, a beit din, can hold a child responsible for causing damage and doing the things that he does. But a 20-year-old, Hashem holds the person responsible, because once you're 20 years old, Hashem looks at the mental process. What's going on in your mind? What were you thinking? What was your intention? So that takes place after 20. And before 20, the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't hold the person responsible for those mental processes. But in terms of action of a 13-year-old, he does. So you're not chayiv b'dinei shamayim. You're too young to be held accountable to Hashem. You're too young to trade, but you are chayiv b'mitzvahs. Why? Because the chiyuv b'mitzvahs of a child, the obligation that a child has to do mitzvot, not only doesn't need intellectual understanding, it shouldn't have intellectual understanding. That comes later. So if you look, there's the Rebbeinu Shalom says in the Torah, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim avadai hem asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Hashem Elokechem. I took the children of Israel are my servants. I took them out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt. Says the Bechor Shor, ume'ota sha'a na'asu avdai. Since I took them out of Egypt, from Paro's hand, they became my servants. That's the point at which they became my servants. And what about before then? What were they before that? So we are slaves to Hashem. We are Avdei Hashem from Yetzias Mitzrayim, from coming out of Egypt. And before then, what were we? Well, just a few psukim before, basically. Hashem says to Moshe, go to Paro and say to him, Ko amar Hashem, so said God, B'ni b'chori Yisrael, B'nei Yisrael is my son. We used to be Hashem's son. After Mitzrayim, we become Hashem's Eved. Asks the Lubavitcher Rebbe, what kind of progression is that? Surely a son is a higher form of connection than a slave? Surely we were slaves to start with, and then we became sons. How do you go from son to Eved? And he explains, because an Eved in some ways is a much greater way of serving Hashem. Because with an Eved, with a slave, there's no ego. I'm doing it because my master wants me to do it. It's got nothing to do with me. When a child reaches the age of 20, he starts philosophizing. Why is this mitzvah? What's it important for? I want to have ta'am. I want to have a taste in the mitzvah. I want it to mean something to me. A mitzvah should be meaningful. Make the Torah meaningful to the child. That's at age 20. At age 13, it doesn't have to be meaningful. What do 13-year-olds do? 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, what are they doing? They're kicking balls around fields. They're dropping balls into hoops. What's the meaning of that? But they're having a pretty good time without the meaning. And if you stop them and you have a philosophic discussion about the meaning of basketball, they're going to look at you, you're crazy. Let me get on with the game. I'm having a good time. They don't need meaning. In fact, meaning introduces ego into the process. Just keep the Torah. Keep the Torah to be mechunach in kedusha. Just kedusha, sanctity is an experience. It's not information. Sanctity is an experience. It's not philosophy. You want to feel sanctity. The father says, don't eat this food. It's treif. The child doesn't say, treif, interesting. What does that mean? And what's the purpose? And what's the philosophy of kashrus? Child stops eating, finished. That's it. That's kedusha. Kedusha is being able to experience it. This is a child of under 13. Comes the child of 13, he starts to keep the mitzvot properly, but not yet from a position of ego. This happens. One of my daughter here sent a very spunky child of hers, my granddaughter, to a school that is very structured and old-fashioned in the way it teaches Torah. And she is astonished that the spunky little kid hasn't lost an ounce of spunk. She says, it's so structured, it's so disciplined, it's so old-fashioned. And the child is as happy as can be. Because at that age, that's what they want, the experience of that structure, the experience of what it is to live Jewishly. You don't have to understand the philosophy. In fact, the philosophy, as Rav Kook says in the Shmoneh Kvotzim, that as society became more sophisticated academically and intellectually and philosophically, we adulterated the kedusha, the simplicity of emunah, of doing something without ego just because the Rebbeinu Shem wants us to do it. Now it's always got to have a reason. Then it ties into our own ego and our own sophistication of understanding. And it actually adulterates. He says one day the world will come back to the simple understanding of emunah. But intellectual sophistication and emunah pshuta, the belief of an eved, of somebody who's serving Hashem, are at odds with each other. They can't work simultaneously. Unless you raise the child as an eved, you raise the child just in that way, as the Rambam describes, Chanoch lanaar al pi darko, treat a young child as a young child. Then later on, when the intellectual process starts kicking in, they have the foundation. And the foundation is one of Eved Hashem. The foundation is one of I do this because I do it. This ties into the medrash that we learned on Shabbos Parshas Vayera, where Avraham Avinu goes and asks advice after he's given the bris milah. He asks the advice from Aner and from Eshkol and from Mamre. What advice does he ask? Hashem told me to have a bris milah. What should I do? Why is Avraham Avinu asking 3 non-Jewish friends whether he should listen to the mitzvahs of Hashem? What is he looking for? And you remember I explained it, that Avraham had not had the opportunity to keep a chok, to keep a mitzvah without ego, to keep a mitzvah just as an Eved Hashem, because everything that Avraham kept, he worked out. He worked out himself. He came to the whole of the Torah himself. So this was the first mitzvah Hashem gave him that didn't come from him. Hashem gave him the mitzvah. This is a potential chok. So he wants to check that it's a chok, that this is a statute that doesn't have intellectual philosophy. So he goes to the 3 philosophers of the day and he says, can you give me a philosophic reason why I should keep this mitzvah? Aya says, no, you're crazy to keep it. Eshkol says, no, you would be crazy to keep it. That can't be what Hashem means from you. He wouldn't want you to put yourself at such risk. Avraham is feeling happy. This means it's a chok. The philosophers can find no reason for this. So the only reason for me to do it is to serve Hashem. This is my first chok. Comes Mamre and says, chok, statute. This is an ethical responsibility you've got. You owe Hashem so much. Look what he's done for you. Are you going to withhold? He asked you to do one little uncomfortable thing. Are you going to withhold that for him? Avraham says, Mamre, you don't have the luxury of statutes. You don't have chukim. Because everything Hashem asks you to do, you are ethically obligated to do because you owe it to him. And Jews altogether, we don't have that privilege of saying it's a chok. And that's why Rashi brings at the beginning of Parshas Chukat that the Satan and the nations of the world ask about a chok, about Pura Aduma. What's the reason? What's the philosophy? And what about us? Do we not ask that question? No, because for us, anything Hashem asks us to do, the philosophical reason to do it is because we're Avdei Hashem, ki Avdaim. They are my servants, they are my slaves. We have to do what Hashem wants. That's an ethical responsibility. It's not even a chok. When a child starts keeping the mitzvahs, he has the opportunity to do it as a chok. When a 13-year-old starts keeping the mitzvahs, he has the opportunity to do it as a chok. He doesn't have to do it as an ethical responsibility. That comes later on. But to lay the foundation of an Eved Hashem. And so yes, when we learn in our sugya that you have to be 20 years old before you can trade because you need a degree of mental sophistication, to start keeping mitzvahs, you don't want that degree of mental sophistication. You don't want to do it because you've studied the philosophy of mitzvahs and you've studied the philosophy of halakha and you know it in your understanding and it's meaningful to you. That comes later on. But the foundation of practice, the foundation of Chanoch lanaar al pi darko, the foundation of to be mechanech, of educating a child into Kedusha, is to be able to do it as an Eved Hashem. I'm doing this simply because Hashem has asked me to do it. I owe Hashem my life. The Jewish people owes Hashem everything that we've got. Hashem asks us to do something, we feel obligated to do it without asking any questions. Once we've accepted naaseh, once we've accepted our ethical obligation to do it, then nishma, we will study the Torah, even though we know the halachot and we're keeping the halachot, we will study the Torah, and that's a chok. That's the irrational piece. That's the only irrational piece. That even though we know all the halachot, we will continue to learn and we will continue to study, because that's the mitzvah that we were given for Limud Torah. And that's the beautiful understanding that we need to take away with us. Young children don't need philosophy. Young children need to experience the beauty, the straightness, the simplicity, and the sanctity of the Torah. The philosophy comes later.